They told me he was just another guest, another handshake in a busy evening. But the moment Jonathan looked at me, really looked at me, I felt something I hadn't felt since the children were small and the house hummed with purpose. One comment he made in the kitchen changed the way I saw my long, quiet nights. If you think a single conversation can't shift the ground beneath your feet, wait until you hear what he said. Before I tell you everything, do me a favor, tell me in the comments from which city you're watching. I love imagining where you are. A porch in Savannah, a high-rise in Chicago, a quiet suburb outside Phoenix. Wherever you are, settle in. This is the story of how a simple dinner introduced me to a part of myself I'd carefully kept in storage, like the good china I never use. I'd spent the afternoon fussing over a roast I wasn't sure would impress anyone. My son Michael had texted early. "Running late, bringing a colleague from work. Don't go overboard, Mom." I almost laughed. I'd been going overboard for 30 years. Overboard fed people, soothed them, wrapped them in the safety of cinnamon and thyme and the lamp glow on the dining table that made even a chipped plate look kind. I set out the linen napkins I keep for special days, tucked a sprig of rosemary into each, and told myself this was just another Thursday. The doorbell sounded and the dog did her usual scramble, nails clicking on the hallway floor like marbles scattering. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened the door to Michael. Tall, handsome, his tie already tugged loose, and behind him, a man whose face I didn't recognize, but who carried himself with the quiet steadiness of the men I grew up trusting. Teachers, the mailman who knew every name, the neighbor who changed flat tires without being asked. "Jonathan," he said, offering a hand. I took it and noticed his grip was firm, but not insistent, warm without trying to be. It was a cool evening, the kind that pulls a sweater over your shoulders and sends the scent of damp leaves through the hallway when the door stays open just long enough. I stepped aside to let them in. Jonathan set a small paper bag on the console table, bread from a bakery I liked but rarely treated myself to, and thanked me for having him. There was a clarity to his voice I wasn't expecting, as if every word had been lowered gently into place. We moved to the kitchen because that's where everyone ends up. I pulled the roast from the oven, and the room filled with a rich, slow warmth that belonged to winter dinners and stories told with elbows on the table. Michael poured wine and recounted a harmless office mishap, the kind that makes everyone laugh and no one feel small. Jonathan listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with a careful curiosity, questions attentive enough to make me feel like my answers mattered. He noticed the old radio on my counter, a sturdy little thing with a rounded face and a dial that still glows when it's on. "You don't see many of those anymore," he said. I told him it used to be my mother's. She'd turn it low during the evenings while she cooked. NPR on Sunday mornings, jazz on Friday nights. He smiled, and there was something in that smile, something like recognition, that made me forget I was worrying about the timing on the green beans. Dinner was easy. The plates passed like conversation. "Here, take some of this." "Oh, you'll like that. Don't be shy." People forget how tender silence can be when it comes between people who are actually listening. Michael told a story about traffic and a construction detour that had all three of us shaking our heads at the minor wars of city driving. Jonathan asked me about my week, and I heard myself say more than I planned, how I'd reorganized the hall closet and found my grandmother's handkerchiefs, how I'd meant to start a new book, but had instead watched the rain braid itself down the window. He asked which book, and when I told him, he nodded and said he knew it. He didn't try to impress me with a summary. He just knew it. That felt like kindness. After dinner, the house found its nighttime rhythm. The dog curled under the table, sighing in that content way dogs do when they've surveyed the perimeter and found nothing that needs guarding. Michael took a call in the other room. It left Jonathan and me stacking plates shoulder to shoulder at the sink. He rolled up his sleeves and reached for a dish towel without asking, and I appreciated that he didn't make a show of insisting, the way some guests do. He simply helped. The old radio hummed a station that only comes in clearly after sunset, soft piano, a saxophone that sounded like late trains. "You keep your home beautifully," he said. "It's a small house," I replied, "but it knows how to hold people." He nodded thoughtfully, and I realized that, to him, that was an answer worth nodding at. In the yellow halo of the stove light, I could see the faint silver at his temples. It reminded me of the sea foam that gathers on rocks, a quiet mark of time. He must have seen me look, because he chuckled, more to himself than to me, and said he'd earned every thread of gray during a long year. I didn't ask for details, and he didn't offer them. We respected the space between what was said and what was not, the way one respects a neighbor's fence, not as a barrier, but as a boundary that makes conversation possible. He dried the last glass and set it carefully in the rack, aligning it the way people do when they believe little things matter. Then he leaned against the counter, hands resting on the edge like he was steadying a small boat. "May I ask you something, Gabriella?" he said. And there it was again, that careful curiosity. "Of course," I said, though my heart gave the smallest lift at hearing my name shaped by unfamiliar vowels. "What do you do with the quiet after a day like this?" It was such a simple question that I almost answered without thinking. But I understood somehow that he didn't mean the logistics of the evening, put the leftovers away, turn off the porch light, check the back door. He meant the quiet itself. What do you do with the space that no one is standing in anymore, the echo of your own footsteps in a clean kitchen, the rooms returning to their original shapes? I told him the truth. I make tea. I turn on the radio. I move slowly through the rooms and put things back where they belong, letting the day settle like snow in a glass ball. Sometimes I write a few lines in a notebook that nobody sees. "Don't laugh," I said. He didn't. He said that sounded like a practice. "A practice?" I repeated. He explained that practices are the things we hold onto so we don't drift too far from ourselves. Michael returned, and the moment changed shape without breaking. He talked about a deadline, apologized for the phone call, asked if anyone wanted dessert. I offered the sliced apples I'd tucked in the fridge and a bit of honey, and we ate them standing around the island like conspirators. Then it was time for coats. Time is polite like that when you have guests. It taps its watch and raises its eyebrows. There is dignity in letting a good evening end. At the door, Jonathan thanked me again, and there it was, the sentence I said changed my nights. "Gabriella," he said, "you create an atmosphere where people feel like they can be honest. It's rare. Don't underestimate that." He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a fact, a gentle one, but solid as the doorframe he stood near. Maybe it was the way the porch light softened the space around us, or the way the night held steady. But I felt something settle inside me with the weight of recognition. I'd spent years perfecting recipes, polishing silver at holidays, refolding towels the way they taught us in the old magazines. I'd thought of hospitality as a set of tasks. He was telling me he saw something else in my home, and in me, a kind of listening that took the starch out of the air and let people breathe. After they left, I stood in the entryway and listened to the house exhale. I switched off the porch light and caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. A woman with a tidy bun at the nape of her neck, a blouse a shade too bright for the season, a face that carried the soft lines of many evenings like this one. I thought of Jonathan's question about the quiet. The quiet was already here, pulling at the edges of the night like a careful seamstress. I made tea. I added a slice of lemon, then took it out again, deciding I wanted the taste of the tea to stand alone. Back in the kitchen, I turned up the radio just enough to keep the silence company and opened my notebook. The first line came easily. He said I shouldn't underestimate it. I didn't know what it was exactly, not yet, but the sentence lay there like a key on the page. I wrote about the way Jonathan had aligned the glasses in the rack, and the way he'd listened as if my smallest habit might be a map. I wrote about my mother's radio and the rosemary sprigs tucked into napkins that nobody mentioned but everyone noticed. I wrote about the dog's sigh, the music's ribbon. When I closed the notebook, the tea had gone warm instead of hot. I carried the cup to the sink and felt the steadying pleasure of water and porcelain and the faint lemon on my fingers. I had the sense of standing in the doorway of something. Not a romance, not yet, and maybe never, but a doorway just the same, the kind that makes you check your step and straighten your shoulders before you cross. The next morning, the house wore the pale light that comes from a sky undecided about its weather. I tied back the curtains and found myself scanning the counter for the bakery bag he brought. The bread was still there, a half loaf wrapped in paper, the ink stamped with an address. I laughed softly at myself and sliced 2 thin pieces, toasting them until they smelled like sundae. The crust was delicate, the inside open and airy like trust. I ate standing at the counter with butter melting into the warm places and wondered how a loaf of bread can feel like a letter. Around mid-morning, Michael called. "Thanks for last night, Mom. Jonathan really enjoyed it. He said you have a good way with people." I kept my voice light, the way mothers do when they're trying to sound casual even though their heart has already turned toward the sound of a new possibility. "He said practice," I told Michael. Michael laughed. "That sounds like him. He's steady." The words settled over me like a shawl. I kept the day ordinary on purpose. Ordinary is how I get my bearings. I ran errands, bought a new sponge because the old one was starting to smell like dishwater no matter how much I rinsed it, returned a library book with a dog-eared page I shamefully undog-eared before the librarian noticed. In the produce aisle, a woman I've known for 15 years asked after my garden, and I told her the basil was holding on. I carried the groceries home and arranged them in the refrigerator as if the order mattered, because sometimes it does. Every so often, though, my mind returned to the question of the quiet. I noticed, as I hadn't before, that the quiet isn't the absence of sound so much as the presence of space. There's a difference. Sound demands. Space invites. I looked at the chair by the window where I rarely sit, and I thought, perhaps tonight I'll try that chair. Not because it's better than the couch, but because it's new to me. Sometimes the smallest change, a chair, a different cup, can show you an aspect of yourself you haven't met. That evening, as if following a cue I hadn't meant to set, I pulled the old radio closer and tuned it until the fuzz cleared. A worn voice introduced a piece of piano music whose name I didn't catch. Notes drifted through the room like moths. I brewed tea, set the cup on the side table, and opened the notebook again. I wrote about the difference between maintenance and care, between a meal that fills and a meal that welcomes. I wrote the word steady and then, beneath it, listening. I understood that what Jonathan had given me wasn't flattery. It was a mirror, held gently, angled just so. You might be wondering what I'm building toward. I am too, if I'm honest. I'm not the kind of woman who leaps. I step, and then I step again. But the steps after Jonathan's visit felt different, like they were carrying me not just across a room, but toward a kind of companionship with my own life. The confidence of it surprised me. I didn't feel younger. I felt exactly my age, which is to say, I felt like a woman who knows the shapes of her days, and is willing, at last, to trace new lines inside them. Late that night, as the neighborhood thinned to the quiet of porch lights and distant televisions, my phone chimed. A new message. From Michael, Jonathan says thanks again. He'd be happy to return the favor. Maybe coffee near the office one day, if you're downtown. He says he knows a place that plays real music, the old kind, on actual speakers. My fingers hovered over the keys longer than they needed to. I typed that I'd like that I was often nearby on Tuesdays, that music sounded perfect. I erased the exclamation point because I wanted the sentence to land calm. Sent. I set the phone down and felt the gentle widening of the room. The dog lifted her head, then slept again. Outside, a car passed and left a brief sheet of light against the ceiling, like a hand smoothing the air. That's when it struck me that the quiet had changed. It wasn't that I had filled it. It was that I had learned to listen to it differently. If you've ever had a night like this, where something delicate and unnamed stands in the room with you, like a guest who has arrived early and doesn't mind waiting, then you know how carefully you move so you don't scare it away. You make tea. You write a line. You choose a chair you've ignored for years and sit there wondering why it took so long. You think about a man who asked a plain question in a kitchen full of dishes and music, who noticed the way you listen, and by noticing, invited you to listen more. That's all it was that first night. No fireworks, no confessions, just the soft click of a door closing and the warmer, steadier quiet that remained. But I will tell you this. By the time I turned off the lamp and went to bed, the house felt less like a place I was responsible for and more like a home that was ready to hold a new conversation, ready to hear an answer I had been carefully not asking. And yes, I slept well. When morning came, I didn't rush it. I let the light take its time along the curtains. I made toast from the bakery bread and thought about the message I'd sent, and about the coffee I hadn't had yet, and about the word he'd given me. Practice, as if it were a small, sustaining loaf I could slice quietly for days. I carried my breakfast to the window and watched an older couple across the street walking hand in hand, steady as tide. I hoped in the unshowy way a woman of 54 hopes that whatever came next would keep that steadiness at its center. If you're still with me, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The town, the neighborhood, the corner shop that knows your name. I want to imagine your streetlights, your kitchens, your quiet rooms. Because this is where the story began for me, not with big declarations, but with the reordering of a small, familiar evening, and the sense that something honest had finally pulled a chair close and asked to stay. The truth is, I didn't expect to see Jonathan again so soon. That Tuesday morning, I found myself choosing my blouse more carefully than usual, the pale blue one with sleeves that brushed just above the wrist. I told myself it was because I had errands near Michael's office, but I knew better. My hands lingered too long on a necklace I rarely wore, a small silver pendant that had been a gift many years ago. It wasn't vanity. It was preparation, the way one might prepare a table even before knowing who might sit at it. The cafe was tucked into a quiet street near the courthouse. I'd passed it dozens of times, never stepping in. That morning, though, I pushed open the door and was met with the sound of vinyl, a saxophone, rich and mellow, the kind of music that fills a room without crowding it. Jonathan was already there, standing to greet me with a smile that carried no rush, only patience. He'd chosen a corner table, away from the busy hum, where the light from the window landed softly on the wood. We spoke easily at first, about coffee beans and how they differ, about the weather that had been threatening rain for days. But then the conversation curved, gently but unmistakably, toward the deeper corners. He asked about the writing I'd mentioned, the notebook I fill at night. "Nobody asks about that," I said. He answered simply, "I thought it mattered to you." And in that moment, I realized how rare it is for someone to see not just what you do, but why you do it. He shared pieces of himself, too, how he'd lost his wife years ago, how the quiet in his home had once felt unbearable until he'd learned to shape it, much the way I do with tea and radio. His honesty was not a performance. It arrived like a steady tide, and I let it wash over me. I found myself telling him things I hadn't spoken aloud in years, about the days after Michael moved out, when the silence in the house felt heavier than any chore. About the way I sometimes felt invisible in grocery aisles, as though I'd faded into the background of other people's stories. Jonathan didn't rush to reassure me or fill the air with empty comfort. He listened, and that listening was its own kind of reply. At one point, when I paused to gather my thoughts, he said, "Gabriella, do you know how many people go their whole lives without speaking truths like that?" I shook my head. He leaned in, lowering his voice just enough so it felt like a secret. "Most people never even hear their own truths. You should treasure that you found yours." We sat for nearly 2 hours, time slipping past like a river we both knew we couldn't stop. The waitress refilled our cups, and neither of us noticed the bustle around us. When I finally stood to leave, Jonathan touched the back of my chair to steady it as I rose, a small gesture, almost nothing, but one that reminded me of a kindness I hadn't felt in too long. Outside, the sky had opened just enough to let a light drizzle fall. Jonathan walked beside me, umbrella in hand, and when we reached the corner, he asked if he might call on me again. Not for Michael's sake, not as a colleague, but for my company. I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, and the word carried more weight than its single syllable should. That night, back in my kitchen, I brewed my tea and opened my notebook. The radio played softly, and I wrote one line across the page. Sometimes another guest is not just another guest at all. Sometimes he is the beginning of a different quiet, one that does not feel empty, but alive. I don't know where this path will lead, but I do know this. At 54, life has surprised me again. And perhaps the most unexpected gift is not the feeling itself, but the realization that it can still arrive, unannounced, and sit across from you in a cafe with music that reminds you to breathe. Tell me, have you ever had a moment like that? A moment when someone you barely knew opened a door you didn't realize had been closed. Where were you, and who was sitting across from you? Share it with me, because those are the stories that keep us alive.